All right, we'll get going here in like 1 minute. I want to make sure we honor our time frame, regardless of how many people we have attending. All right, are you all ready to go? All right. So good afternoon for those of you that are joining us. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started with our presentation shortly, but just a few notes about today's format before we begin. We will start with a pre-recorded video for the first portion of this webinar. So for those of you that are listening, as you're listening, please feel free to post questions in the Q&A tab down in the taskbar at the bottom of your screens. Keep in mind that the purpose of our work today is to engage in a conversation about how students talk about race in the classroom. And so none of us are experts. We are a panelist that are passionate about the importance of this work, and all of our panelists are just passionate about this in their practice. And so momentarily we'll be turning our cameras off to begin the pre-recorded portion of the session. After the pre-recorded portion, we will turn our cameras back on for a live Q&A portion. And so just keep in mind that as you ask questions, feel free to be doing that during the recorded portion as well as during the live portion of the Q&A. After today's session, you will be receiving a survey to complete just to provide some feedback and to give us some thinking around other topics that might be of interest to our attendees. In addition, we'll be sharing a link that contains the resources that we're going to be discussing or will be talked about today as well. We hope you enjoy. Thank you for joining us. So at this time, we will all turn our cameras off and we will begin the pre-recorded portion of our session. Over the summer, we did a series of webinars and our audience feedback pointed to this topic as an area that was of interest. And so today we are really happy to have panelists of teachers from the Kansas City community to include and contribute in this conversation. My name is Jen Fergerson. I'm a project coordinator with the Institute for Urban Education here at UMKC. The Institute for Urban Education is a cohort scholarship program for pre-service teachers that focuses on equity and social justice. We hope that today's webinar is of support for all students and teachers that are engaged in this challenging but important work of equity and social justice in education. The format for our session is as follows. First, we'll provide a little context around this topic. Then we will have our panelists provide some examples of the ways that they have engaged in this work. And finally, we have a chunk of minutes at the end for our panel to discuss and answer questions about this work. Our main goals for today's session are for you to be able to identify some time in your day that makes space for it. We also hope that you come away able to describe and put to use some of the ideas or strategies that would be relevant in your own classroom. We know that in the current environment of remote teaching, this kind of work can often be put on the back burner. But we hope to shed some ideas on how this can look both in person as well as how it might look with distance learning. We always want to preface this work by saying we are all learning in this process. None of us on this panel would claim to be an expert. Instead, we're a group of practitioners that are navigating the current climate and events occurring in our country. And as is working with all teaching, this is ongoing. This learning is ongoing, and when we know better, we do better. And so the next few slides are intended to provide a big picture frame for this work. These conversations in our classrooms are important for many reasons, but it would be remiss not to note the connection to current events in our country. These are just a few of the happenings that students have an awareness or probably have an awareness about from their families, from the media, from their communities, from their friends. Conversations and the role of race or the noticings that students have in relationship to these kinds of events are very much tied to the development of their critical consciousness, as we're about to discuss. Culturally relevant teaching is a pedagogy that empowers students intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically by using cultural reference to impart knowledge, skills, and attitudes. This is defined and is the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings. And you can see here, she outlines 3 areas when we're thinking about culturally relevant teaching: academic achievement, cultural competence, and socio-political critical consciousness. And so while they all work together and need to be present in order to be engaged in really culturally relevant teaching, much of what we're going to discuss today aligns with providing students that opportunity to connect and really develop that socio-political critical consciousness. As teachers, we can ask ourselves some of these questions as a guide to ensure that we're providing opportunities and space for students to engage in these conversations. For example, when racist incidents occur in our society or in our students' lives, do we give them the space to process and talk about it? Or when we're teaching about the history of events, do we teach students how to consider the voices that are present in the information? Do we explicitly teach them to consider other perspectives? And have we informed ourselves about what those alternative perspectives might be, or taken out our own personal beliefs or biases? And so, in building on the importance of developing that critical consciousness for students, these conversations are important because they do allow for agency and for students to feel like they have a voice. It helps them think critically about multiple perspectives. It's relevant in their lives, in their communities, in their world. It promotes positive identity and it validates the questions and concerns that they have. It can create connections that students naturally make when teachers are reading books in their classroom, or when they see things in the media or hear things in their homes and in their communities. Here you see some of the demographics of 2 of the larger districts in our Kansas City area. We're talking about roughly 39,000 students, of which approximately 35,000 students are students of color. So in other words, we have students of color sitting in our classrooms, and therefore the issues that are currently impacting different racial groups in our country have an impact on our students. And so it's more important than ever that our students recognize that their perspectives are important and that the narratives of the world might be different from their experiences. And not only is that okay, but it's also the kind of thinking that we need them to take with them as they become adults and take into becoming members of society. Of equal note is the racial breakdown of our teachers. We know that approximately 80% of classroom teachers in our country are white. In Kansas City public schools, as you see here, we see those statistics are a bit more favorable. There's 40% of teachers identifying as teachers of color, yet we still have a gap where there are 90% of students are students of color. So we as teachers, regardless of our race, must be reflective about that and be reflective in the lens that we might bring into our classrooms to ensure that we allow for all voices and for all perspectives to be heard. And so how do we set the stage? This quote was lifted from an article on the site Embrace Race that's really about white parents talking to their white children. However, the message is one that's important to keep in mind as teachers as well. So I'm going to go ahead and read the quote for you. Young children are busy sorting their environment, putting like with like, and we encourage them to do this every time we ask them to organize their toys or at school, find all the circles in the bin of shapes. When they do this with each other, we often become uncomfortable and want to silence them. The thing is, when we shush a child for noticing a racial difference or when they say something misguided or biased, they don't stop noticing or forming biases. They just learn to keep these observations to themselves. In other words, we're highlighting the importance that when our students bring up differences, Whether we have students of color sitting in front of us, whether we have a classroom of white students, whether we have white students that are the minority in our classrooms, regardless, it's important that we validate those questions and those noticings, and that those things don't go missed, or because those are missed opportunities. And so it's really important to think of those moments as an opportunity for students to grow and think critically about their world, and validating the importance and the fact that it's okay to recognize those differences and talk about it. Many of you are probably familiar with Teaching Tolerance. It's a website focused on providing resources that support diversity, equity, and justice. As we think about how to get started doing this kind of work, this is a list of suggestions compiled from their site that are really relevant to today's conversation. As teachers, it's important we inform ourselves in order to engage and grow in our comfort in these conversations, so that we kind of normalize these conversations. And so, two things I want to highlight here are the importance of dispelling the ideas about a biological basis for race, and the history of race as a social construct and means of control. It's important as educators that we acknowledge that race is socially constructed, the history of which is long and worth all of us understanding more fully. Most of us probably received little history that involved multiple perspectives. And so therefore, when we're thinking about these topics with students, we must take the time to ensure that we find out what those other perspectives might be. Because these discussions can open the door for students to learn not only about injustices, but also about the beauty of differences. So here, when we think about how we fit this into our day, you see here a list of common instructional blocks that are occurring in schools. These are general places that you might consider fitting these kinds of topics into your day. In an elementary classroom, there's multiple opportunities where these conversations could be relevant. If you've not started doing this kind of conversation with students, it could be as simple as posing a question in a morning meeting, during lunch, or other places in the day, to allow students a chance to share their questions, their voices, their perspectives. It might occur in reading, in the reading that they're doing, whether that's their independent reading, whether that comes from a read aloud in class, or a read aloud that's happening across the content areas. Maybe it has to do with science and the environment, or maybe it has to do with a social studies concept. In math, for example, if I'm learning about data, could I use real statistics, or at least provide some scaled examples for students to consider, and then bring their perspectives into the conversation in their analysis of the data? We know that currently COVID is affecting our people of color at a disproportionate rate. And so how could we allow students an opportunity to analyze that data, or look at data through that lens, to make it very relevant in their own lives? In read alouds, again, across contents, this is a really easy way to insert these kinds of topics in. Writing workshop is another natural opportunity for students to discuss the ways that other authors have presented their perspectives, and think about how they as writers can share their perspective or their experience related to relevant social justice issues, or issues of their own identity. Across the content areas, again, in thinking about social studies and some of those larger themes that arise out of the standards, thinking about things like community, identity, citizenship, historical perspectives, political developments, economic concepts. These kinds of conversations can easily be inserted into any of those areas. Here we've created a short list of some possible structures or strategies that you might use in the classroom to support the conversations about race or other social justice topics. Accountable talk is an intentional practice that teaches students how to agree and disagree, how to notice and wonder. It allows for students to share multiple perspectives in a civil and respectful manner. There's Socratic or Paideia seminars, which are a way for students or for teachers, excuse me, to kind of back out of the conversation and take on the role of a facilitator, creating space for students to share and talk authentically about a topic. Sometimes journaling might be a strategy for students to write their thinking before moving into a larger discussion within the classroom. Additionally, if it might look like young students talking with a partner before or talking with a small group before moving that conversation to a larger group, or it might look like doing some shared writing together. In remote learning, we might consider having students construct some conversational norms in the same way that we would in person, in the same way that we might be culturally responsive in co-constructing our classroom rules and classroom norms. We might need to be doing those kinds of things for remote learning when we're engaging in these kinds of conversations. Critical literacy is a practice that helps students consider or think about those multiple perspectives. So teaching students explicitly to be looking for that and identifying those things that might be missing from a story or from a text. And then close reading is another opportunity or strategy for students to be really analyzing closely for those perspectives or those points. This is a chart that was shared on a site called facingourhistory.org. This is a site that you do need to sign up for, but it is free and you have access to most of the resources upon registering. Here we see some general ideas for engaging students in these conversations with the use of some protocols that might provide students with some structure and in having these conversations. And so I will say that this site is geared more towards secondary, but much of these ideas or these strategies can easily be adapted for elementary. And the nice thing about this is it gives you some ideas about what to utilize, what strategies to utilize, as well as they've done some adaptations for remote learning as well. And so that brings us to the end of our pre-recorded portion. And at this time, we will move into meeting our panelists and hearing about some of the specific ways that they've engaged in this work. And so at this time, we're going to transition to our back to our PowerPoint. While we're kind of getting that up and running, I want to thank Jordan Smith. She is our admin assistant for the Institute for Urban Ed, and she's kind of behind the scenes today. So thank you to her for doing that. Jordan, you can go to the next slide, please. So I'm really excited to introduce all of our panelists today. And our first panelist is Leena Hammouda. Leena is a Muslim American Palestinian. She was born in Kansas City and has lived here her whole life. Her mother is a white American and her father is a Palestinian American who immigrated to the US when he was 18 years old to study at UMKC. Growing up, she didn't see many educators who looked like her, and so she became one. She enjoys writing, baking, and the great outdoors. So we're going to listen to some of the specific ways that Leena has kind of addressed this topic in her own teaching, in her own practice.
Hi, my name is Leena Hammouda, and I'm going to be talking about social justice in the classroom with a focus in cross-curricular studies to implement a culturally responsive classroom community. Education means liberation. Educators for social justice practices strive for the well-being of their students and their community. They seek to engage in praxis, making wise decisions and practical decisions that will transform a community of learners. If representation truly matters, then students need a fighting chance to be taught by teachers of color, teachers of other beliefs, or other culturally responsive teachers. Students must be allowed to connect with individuals unlike themselves and the tools to do better in life. Our work is centered around integrity, excellence, empathy, and equity. It's important to mention the ratio of ELL students to non-ELL students in Kansas City, Kansas public schools. in any other school district for that matter. There is a 3-to-1 ratio, and it's important because literacy is the gateway to success. So, one of my professors asked me recently, what was my least favorite subject? And I responded with science. And they asked me why. And I said, well, because I didn't see many women of color or women who looked like me in the work field. And so when you take a look at this graph, it should alarm us. Here are some snapshots on a unit of study that my third grade students did last year. So students were able to observe, discuss, and actively participate through various critical lenses in a hands-on experience of our nature's bounties. And students identified careers that are possible with a background in STEM. They also described characteristics of a diverse group of people who are successful in STEM. Later on, they explored the human impact and solutions to keep things around us healthy. They also invested ideas to reduce human impact and connected it to a local level. Together, we explore the demographics of who worked as scientists and engineers in science and engineering occupations. And so I asked questions about the different charts. So there was also a bar graph as well. I added scaffolds in such as language stems, also increasing the level of questioning. And so one thing that I wanted to mention is social justice is not about speaking up to the injustices that we see. It's also breaking down language barriers too that may seem elitist, discriminatory, or a place where there is an uneven balance of power between English speakers and English learners. And so I always try to provide language frames for those for our students, for ELL students and non-ELL students. One of my favorite theorists illustrates, well, his name is Paulo Freire. He illustrates that individuals are not outside of the social structure because of their illiteracy, but they are illiterate because of systemic oppression. Public schools must provide resources such as professional development and equity training around culturally responsive pedagogy to meet our historically exploited communities' literacy needs. One of the most powerful things that happened in this unit was when I posed these 3 questions: who has the power, who has the opportunity, and who has the encouragement? Wow, their answers were phenomenal. And I encourage every single one of you future educators or even educators right now to ask your students this. Justice-oriented outcomes in the classroom look like learners listening to themselves and also listening to alternating life perspectives and breathing new experiences as they invent themselves. These are things that you can do beyond having creating a unit. You can do this through establishing a culture of routines and procedures, through your lesson planning, and also demonstration of questions. We talked about environmental injustice and redlining. And so here are some questions that my third graders posed. One of them is really, close to holding people accountable. So for example, Chloe, what do people do about the pollution in other places? Or why are homes in Wyandotte still painted with lead? So we went ahead and we explored Anita Easterwood's mural and talked about her artistic experiences. Students went ahead and created digital murals since we were learning online, and wrote letters to their classmates about how they should be in the workforce in regards to STEM. Students can be advocates for things they need in school. True praxis is the act of simultaneously being helped and helping those in need. Lastly, here was a poem that we created together. And continued on. Here is the last part of it. In the end, students looked at the bigger pictures, actively listened to other perspectives, built bridges to engage in empathetic dialogue, created opportunities to extend their help or receive the help, and celebrated their journey to transformation. Here are some amazing websites that I use all the time. And here are some books that really help push my thinking as well. Thank you so much. Bye.
Our next panelist is Dayonne Richardson. Dayonne Richardson is a children's book author and an educator. She began her career as an educator in 2012 and has had the opportunity to teach in America and China. Her educational audience ranges from elementary to college to professional educators. She currently teaches third grade at Hogan Preparatory Elementary School in Kansas City, Missouri. And Dayonne is an alumna of the Institute for Urban Education here at UMKC.
Hello, everyone. Hi, I come to you as Dayonne Richardson, educator as well as author, to talk about ways that I have talked about race in my elementary classroom. So one thing I want to touch on this main page is the idea of the power of books. Books are a beautiful way to encourage and inspire students creatively, as well as expose them to different cultures. So some ways that we can do that with books is we can have them be mirrors where students are able to see themselves, to see their own culture through the text that we pick. They can become windows in the opportunity to see other cultures, as well as sliding doors. So I have for you today some of the examples that I have used read alouds in my classroom as mirrors and as windows. And those are just a few of the ways. There are so many more ways that we can use read alouds to make it culturally relevant. So one of my favorite celebrations is Hispanic Heritage Month. And it is very important to me, even if I do not have any Hispanic students in my class, that they learn about the special educators and influencers that are in the Hispanic culture. And so here are some of my favorite read alouds. We have Pele, we have Ellen Ochoa, we have Celia Cruz, we have Cesar Chavez. And I'm going to reference Cesar Chavez at the end of this because there's a special video to show. As well as one of my favorites, Frida. On this day, my outfit was inspired by her, and students got the opportunity to learn about her beautiful artwork and how she persevered through very trying things. And as I said, even if I don't have any students that are of the Hispanic descent, we are learning about them all. And for my times where I have taught this and I've had Hispanic students, it's always been a pleasure for them to see themselves as a mirror in the text. All right, so this is a unit that I did last year that was my absolute favorite. I called it Hair We Grow Again. You get it? So for this unit, we went over the self-pride of our own hair, and how we go about self-care and taking care of it. And we had a classroom beauty shop, a beauty barber shop, where we had things that the community sent us. They gave us a chance to kind of play with hair, as well as figure out how to care for it. And so over time, students brought in things that they used on their own hair, from products to do-rags to anything like that. And it gave us a new opportunity to learn about other cultures and how they take care of their hair as well. And so we learned about the turban and how to put the turban on. And we just got a really cool, interesting opportunity to be proud of our own hair texture. Whatever it looks like, be proud of it because it is your own. And we got a chance to compare and contrast that. So that was something we did last year that was really awesome. Oh, and for that activity as well, we did get the opportunity to go to a hair store, which was not far from our school. And we interviewed the shopkeeper. We took pictures. We made illustrations. It just was a really good exploration activity that was culturally relevant to the students I had in my class. it only limited was not only solely by it being a mirror, but it also was a window for students who had different hair texture. Okay, so this is another favorite of mine. We celebrated the Chinese New Year. And as I said, if I don't have any students that are of the Asian descent, I am okay with that. I'm okay with the fact that students now have a window and a sliding door into another culture, into trying something new. I gave them the phrase, if you don't like something, you don't say, oh, that's nasty. You just say it's not my favorite, because we want to show respect for other cultures and other things that they do. And something that was really special that you all could also do, I partnered with Panda Express, and they gave us fortune cookies, and they gave us chopsticks, and I bought some popcorn, and we practiced chopsticks, practiced how to use chopsticks. It was really awesome. And having had taught in China a couple summers, I was able to bring back those artifacts, check out books, and it was a really great exploration time. And so let's see here if it'll allow me to show the video. Okay. All right, so as I said, I'm going to come back to a video, and this video is up to date. Those experiences that I've showed about how to make my read-alouds culturally relevant, those were all opportunities to be in the classroom. But this experience that I'm about to show is how I have done that virtually.
All right, so this morning we touched on one of my favorite Hispanic leaders for Hispanic Heritage Month. We touched on Cesar Chavez, and we got to the portion where talking about like how the farmers were treated unjustly and things like that. And one of my students wrote in the chat, "This is just like 2020." And I had her turn her mic on and share what she meant by that. And she started talking about how people are treated unfairly because of their race. People are getting killed in the streets because of the protests and things like that. And another girl talked about how little kids are getting killed from gun violence. Like these are things that my kids are currently experiencing. In the state of Missouri, in Kansas City, Missouri, there was a car that got shot up, I believe 13 times, and there was a 1-year-old in the car. This is something my students knew. This is something they know because that's their backyard. And so while it is a hard thing to touch on, it's our reality. As a Black woman, it is my reality. As Black students, it is their reality. And so I gave everybody a space to share that wanted to share. And they talked about Martin Luther King and how he also fought for the unjust. And I put it back on them. I said, you know what? You're coming up in a generation where there's a lot of nonsense going on. You can be the Martin Luther Kings. You can be the one that fight for the unjust. You could be the ones that stand up when you see something wrong. And so I'm just grateful for literature and text that brings about conversation, that brings about opportunities for us all to think and to process, because a lot is going on in our world. And our kids get it. Yes, they're kids, but they get it, they feel it, and they can relate. So that's just my experience from today.
All right. And so, as I was saying, books can be a beautiful tool to bring race into the conversation, to bring cultural relevance into the conversation. And it is totally worth it to not only be a mirror, but be a window, be a sliding door. Thank you.
And our final panelist, last but not least, we have Joyce Wong. Joyce is a first-generation college graduate immigrating from Hong Kong. Her experiences as an ESL student defined her pathway towards becoming an educator. She's a Teach for America alum, founding a charter school in St. Louis. She is a Kansas City leadership cohort
My name is Joyce Wong. I'm an instructional coach with the Kansas City, Kansas Public School District. I am going to show you something that I have worked on and created for our school in order to help bridge and create ways for students to have social justice in their coursework, especially while we're learning asynchronously and synchronously. So I have a 3-week mini unit for social studies that teachers could be using up until election. And I created a calendar so it's easy to follow, and it allows teachers and families and students to have discourse about the topics that we discuss, as well as 3 days of the week where they work on assignments asynchronously. And so this is an assignment that they did for kindergarten through 5th grade. I made it adaptable for every grade, where they talk about neighborhoods and community and what it means to show kindness, have integrity, in like the beginning of what an identity is. On Mondays and Fridays, they have discourse, where on Monday they discuss vocabulary and what they will be working on for the week, and just their initial ideas. And then by Friday, they talk about the actual assignments. So here's an example for week 1. It links to an actual script that teachers would be saying. So here's what they would be asking for Monday. And by Friday, they have a live discussion about what they've learned and how to take care of their community. Going back, week 2's theme is about identity, who you are, how does your identity affect others, and there's various activities that help students make better understanding of what an identity is and who they are. This is a really great week too, because then students can actually start talking about this topic at home too, and how the people in their lives shape their identities. Finally, in week 3, we talk about using your citizenship within your community and why we are responsible for our community, how we can be responsible for it, what to do if things that are not great are happening, such as civil disobedience, and other ways to support your community through voting, through activism. And then finally, how you would be able to, like, what goals you have and want to set for your future self in order to help and influence others. And so this is an example of like a mini 3-week unit that I have made, or that anyone's able to use. If you want it, you guys can have it too, to help support learning there. Also in the past, I've been someone who really wants to help nourish and foster student identities and where like their personal histories come from. And so when I used to teach at the Kaufman School, I was someone who led our social justice group there for kids too, and wrote our school-wide lessons there as well. If you want to see pictures of like murals and things of student output that were live in person, I have plenty of examples of that too. Thanks again.
So you can see here we've got a list of references We will also be sharing these resources that have been touched on today in your chat shortly as well, in a Wakelet that we've created. So at this time, I would ask that all of our panelists go ahead and we'll turn our cameras on and we will begin sort of the kind of live portion of our Q&A here. And hopefully I won't get booted off again via technology. And so for those of you that have any questions as you about things that you've been hearing, or as we are having our conversation, if you have anything that you'd like to ask, please feel free to, again, drop those questions in the Q&A down in that taskbar below. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of ask a few questions, and you guys feel free to, you all just feel free to jump in and we'll just have a conversation. And so I guess just in starting, all of you took such really different kind of lenses and different takes and in terms of content areas, at least. What's some of your advice for getting started and having these conversations for teachers? So in thinking about how teachers kind of get started in this work, what is some of your advice?
I would say the first thing that came to mind is like identifying your why. I think we all have different things that tug at our heartstrings, that we are passionate about, that we exude to our students. And, you know, we're very intentional about where we work and the students that we work with. So I would say identifying your why. I know social justice is very near and dear to my heart, as well as exposure to other cultures. And so that is very important to me. So whenever I'm teaching, there's always elements of that embedded. And I feel like with the other panelists, those are things that they're passionate about too. And so it comes out whenever they speak or whenever they teach. So I would say identifying your why.
I think it's also really important to make sure that your classroom or any environment that you're like talking about these vulnerable topics with does feel inclusive and safe. And that actually that also starts with you being vulnerable and sharing something personal that you feel safe telling kids about, like something that you've gone through and experienced. And then like as a teacher or as an adult who wants to support students in their learning about themselves as well, like actually listening and noticing what resonates with kids or the topics that are like the most important to them, and then finding ways to continue to like foster that interest or their activism by pushing them forward.
I would like to echo both of them too. And I also want to say, first things first is find the people who are already doing the work. Because sometimes as you are beginning the work, there might still be misconceptions. I think there are still misconceptions and a lot of unlearning that goes on, even when you are an accomplice in any given social justice scenario. And so one thing that I want to mention too is being culturally responsive is looking beyond the classroom, looking beyond scanning bodies of students who you can identify as, oh, they're a different color, or they're this or that. It's going beyond that. It's listening and presenting narratives that people have never heard of before. And you doing less of the talking and you do more of that soul searching and searching for those peoples, those communities of color, those ethnic communities that can do a lot of that, that bridge building between the community and the classroom.
I love that. And I think as you were, you can hear the passion that all of you have as you're talking about the importance of this and how that looks. And you kind of have touched on this in different ways, but what would you say is how do you set the stage for students in the classroom? Joyce, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but how do you create that environment that is really inclusive in your classrooms? What are some things that you specifically do or would suggest to do in order to do that?
I think first things first, again, sorry. I'm like, first, be unapologetically you. They need to see that vulnerability. There's so much stigma around what a good classroom looks like, and we need to break away from that. And I think that's what stresses out a lot of kids and teachers too, is like, well, we got to make sure that we're, following the curriculum standards, but we also want to make sure that we encourage student aid and agency. But we also kind of have to face the hard facts too. Like, America is deeply struggling with tolerating non-Eurocentric curriculum, and like accepting diversity, and really extending the conversation. And I think giving students that choice in terms of like what assignments they want to do, and that choice of how they want to represent their learning, is um, a great leap in establishing a student-centered focus.
And I would say, to add to that, I feel like honesty is so important. I think when you start getting into social justice concepts, it's like, as an educator, it's like, you can't say that. Your students are surprised to hear you being honest about, like, yeah, I did see that on the news. That
Mhm.
upset you. Okay, let's talk about that.
Right.
Like giving them that space, or even being someone who has traveled out of the country, and I've tried all different kinds of like food that was so different. And then students saying like, oh, that's gross, and saying like, you know what? I thought it was gross at first too. But I had to be respectful of the culture I was in. And so I developed a phrase, that's not my favorite. And so to give students that language of now knowing like, hey, you can voice if you have a concern. There's a way to do it. And so not shutting them down, not silencing them. I think that we're so used to our students being silenced because it's not proper, or it's not appropriate. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about that. I'm going to give you a space to share those concerns in a way that's safe, as well as show you, okay, here's how you can say it in a more protective way. And so I think honesty is everything. If your students don't feel safe with being honest about concerns they're having, or a belief that may be different than your own, then that can break down the community of the room. And so letting them know, like, I'm going to be honest with you, and I want you to be honest with me.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, when you think about, you kind of talked, Leena, you mentioned this as far as, when thinking about curriculum and thinking about some of those barriers that are in place, teachers are sometimes restricted in what we are able to, we're supposed to stay on this certain timeline, or we're supposed to follow this pace, and we're supposed to be doing this or that. So what are some suggestions that you might have as far as how do we deal with those barriers that are in the way, that get in the way of doing this kind of, bringing in this kind of conversation or these kinds of topics and that more student-centered work? So how do you work around that? What are some of your tips for that?
One thing that I do is it's amazing what technology does for an educator. And so one thing that I do is I reach out to other educators, even beyond KCKPS. I reach out to people around the nation, and I see what things that they're doing. And there are a lot of websites out there that do that implement like cross-curricular studies that do focus on the standard. We sometimes think that the standard is like a one set thing that we just need to like just drive on and just hone in on, and we can still do that as long as we are amplifying the voices of our classroom students. And so there are a lot of podcasts out there. There are a lot of textbooks out there that do engage in a lot of that work. And so that's one of the things that I tend to resort to. And also unpacking those standards. When you unpack those standards, there's nowhere in there that says you can't teach this.
Right.
There's nowhere.
Yeah. Knowing your standards is really helpful.
Still learning.
Yeah. Does anyone want to add into that?
I would say that I have made my administrators an ally, by showing them like, hey, I know we're supposed to do this, but there's value in me also adding this as well. And like letting them know like the purpose behind it as well as the meatiness of me embedding those same things in there, even though it goes beyond what I was expected to do. And I feel the more that they see the benefit for our students, the more likely they're going to say, Ms. Richardson, that wasn't supposed to be what y'all are working on today. You're supposed to be working on this.
Right.
And so I think me using student data, me using those relationships built in the community, that has helped a lot with administrators trusting those decisions. They might not always trust the decisions that you make as an educator. And so sometimes it's kind of like you apologize later instead of asking first. But the goal is what's best for our kids. The goal is what's best for our kids. And once your administrators know that, they can see the value in you making those decisions and knowing like sometimes you have to go away from the curriculum to have those teachable moments. Like in my video, I talked about how my student touched on what's going on in 2020. That wasn't in the curriculum. That was nowhere in there, but it was a place that it needed to be embedded because it was authentic learning.
Yeah.
I think what you were just saying too about, yes, you're connecting it to the real lives and their communities. But then also the point of making sure that, like, if you have a really culturally responsive classroom where your kids feel like they are part of the conversation and help, create the norms of your classroom. They have a voice in their space that they share with you. Having that really strong foundation pays dividends in the long run for their education. Like the kids are really responsive to feeling safe. And everybody does. So like if they know that they have like psychological safety where they are, then they're going to be showing up. They are going to continue to work hard. They understand because of your like transparency why this is important, why like even stopping a lesson to talk about something that is occurring is important, and how taking that time to discuss it will allow you to have that be released and then continue to focus on like the standards.
Yeah. How would you say that this has shifted moving to remote? I know, Dayonne, you kind of gave that example of how it authentically came up in a recent remote session, but what are some other ways that you have been able to navigate this, doing this kind of thing in the remote space as well and teaching remotely?
Well, I will say we are celebrating the Day of the Dead. And so I have a couple practicum students in my class, and they have been very intentional about the text they're selecting. And I do have one student in my class who is a Hispanic young lady, and she gets so excited because her family loves celebrating the Day of the Dead. And you should see her lighting up the chat, giving us information, teaching us. We have the opportunity to become the students. And so I would say I am still continuing my work with picking authentic texts.
That's great. Talk a little bit about, we haven't touched much on how does this change at all when you're talking about the lower grades, when you're talking about those K through 2 grade levels?
I will give you kind of like a snapshot of what happened last year when I was teaching 3rd grade. So it was the beginning of the year, and we were talking about our writerly life unit, and so it's kind of inquiry based, and we were doing things in our writer's notebook and selecting quotes that meant a lot to us. And then as the unit progressed, we talked about identities and started showcasing. I started showcasing authors of color, and the moment that I started talking about like this person that is such and such, or this Black person, or this brown person, or whatnot, some of my African American students were like, that's racist. And I asked them, I said, what is racist? When you say the word Black or when you say the word African American? And so one thing that came to my mind was what Ibram Kendi put in his book. He had to unlearn his own learned racism. And instead of me justifying, oh, no, I was like, that's really interesting. I want to take a look deeper. And so I sat with that student and they were telling me that none of their teachers beforehand had ever showed a person of color author, had never talked about race in the classroom. So of course, these things that we're telling students or even not showing students impacts their identity. And so what I did was, I know that I can't fix it, but I did have a conversation with their family. And I was like, hey, this was something that happened in the classroom. Think that you're a better voice at communicating what your struggles are, what your life is like, because I can't do that for you. But I knew like deep down that this was something that my students of color, even with myself, like I'm a white passing person of color because my father is Middle Eastern. This is something that we struggle with in terms of our identity, because so much has been of people telling our story and it really being ingrained in our practices and in our beliefs. And so I'm doing a lot of unpacking too.
Yeah. You touched on how you've kind of involved families in this, and we've got a question in the chat there. And that's a beautiful way to bring the families in and get their voices involved in this. So are there other ways that you feel that families can play a role in some of this that anybody else wants to elaborate on?
There was a time I was in a second grade class, and we focused on different cultures in the classroom. So I focused on, okay, there's some Indian students in my classroom, there's some African American students, like there was all different demographics in my class. And we ended up having like a big cultural celebration where everyone brought their food in. We learned how to greet one another in the different languages, and students got a chance to bring in artifacts. It was like a show and tell, almost, of students sharing, like, this is something that's really important to my family. And so students got a chance to showcase that in front of the school, as well as their family were there. And so I think it gave everyone an opportunity to see one another. We had grandparents come. I remember there was one student, his grandmother picked him up early from school, and they were an Indian family, and we all were able to say hello. And it was just the cutest thing. And she was surprised that we knew how to say hello. And so I feel like family is a big part of the dynamic in students feeling safe, as well as showing them like, hey, this matters too. You matter too. I'm thinking about when I taught third grade, I had a student, they just came from Puerto Rico, and it was when the hurricanes and all that hit. And so his sister and his dad were still there. Him and his mom came, and the kids were like, we want to write letters. We want to get donations. And so we all sent like care packages to Puerto Rico through the mom. But family is very important in this work that we do.
Yeah.
I think that it's important to also make sure to include communities or families beyond just like big events, because like your lives revolve around the community. And one of the things that I loved being able to be a part of and starting, but then also like creating something that has a life beyond you, like when you leave a place. So like thinking about the community that I used to live in St. Louis. And I taught at a school that was 99, it was 100% free reduced lunch. And I would say it was like 97% Black and 3% Hispanic. And our kids had very little technology experience. And this was for lower elementary. And I think that oftentimes our communities get stuck in bubbles that kind of don't ever really break. And so thinking about like what kind of things do our kids really love and want to have more experience in, it was clear that like coding was something that was going to be like kids want that, and they don't have a lot like at where we were in St. Louis, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to like join a club or like have, you know, things like that. And so reaching out to like, I don't know, even like university students who are in engineering, or finding like some sort of after school program that you are able to like get sponsorship in, or just creating something on your own that allows kids to come together even once a week. Parents love stuff like that, and or being able to like put their kids through an after school program that has like this huge life impact, or like building interest in kids in a future endeavor if that's what they want. And even still, just like with computers or like coding club and things like that, having exposure so that they build other types of skills like fluency in typing, fluency in navigating like in our world a very technological and global community.
Yeah, I would echo all of your sentiments around, you know, those different ways to incorporate family, whether it's those bigger events, whether it's engaging the community and families in meeting the needs or the interests of our students. And then Leena, to your point around really kind of trying to involve families in the conversation, because like you said, their experience, you can't relate their experiences are theirs, and so having that open dialogue with families is really important for that particular reason as well. And so that kind of brings us to the end of our time today. I want to thank our panelists so much. You all have been amazing. I appreciate your voices in this conversation, and I hope maybe we can have some sort of reunion down the road and maybe continue this conversation, because I really appreciate having all of you with us today. And so I want to thank all of you that were watching. Before we go, I am going to really quickly just drop in the chat for anybody that is on here. There's a Wakelet link. Oh, I just sent it privately. Just Joyce, sorry. Let me try that again. So there is a link in to all the panelists, or those of you that are still watching. So all of these resources will be available there, as well as we will be posting these online on our website at some point hopefully in the near future. And please be on the lookout as well for a survey, because that will give us some input on the conversation today, as well as other topics that you might be interested in hearing and learning more about. So thank you to everyone. Thank you, panelists. Everyone have a great night. Thank you.